adopt the minutes. I think I will call to order the 75th meeting of the Massachusetts Gaming Commission on August 22nd, 2013, 9:30 a.m. at the Division of Insurance, 1000 Washington Street. We will start with the adoption of the minutes. Commissioner McHugh.
The minutes, Mr. Chairman, are in the book, and apart from typographical errors, of which there's at least one, I would move their adoption as contained in the book.
Second?
Second.
Anybody have any comments besides typos? All in favor? Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it. Unanimously, unanimous being 4-0. Commissioner Cameron has had her knee replaced and won't be back with us for a little while. Next on the agenda is a report from Jill Griffin, the Director of Workforce Development and Supplier Diversity. Director Griffin.
Good morning, Chairman Crosby and Commissioners.
Make sure you speak into that thing a little bit.
So, good morning, Commissioners, Chairman Crosby. It's my pleasure to be here today to introduce our friends from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries. And they're going to present on the Massachusetts seafood industry. And in addition to presenting to you today, the Division of Marine Fisheries has agreed to join a statewide mass gaming supplier task force. And statewide task force members will serve as resources for our applicants and licensees to create relationships with small businesses, potential vendors, and the applicants. And support the preparation of small business owners across the state in becoming capable, qualified suppliers and vendors to the casino industry. So as Mass Gaming's Director of Workforce, Supplier Development and Diversity, my role is to make sure the applicants are aware of the contacts and resources in our partner state agencies that support Massachusetts small businesses. And the presentation that follows is similar in intent to the presentations by the Department of Energy Resources, the Department of Agriculture, and the Mass Office of Business Development's Creative Economy presentation. And I hope that these presentations help applicants better understand the Massachusetts economy and make it easier to support the diverse small businesses that make up our industries, and today the seafood industry. After all, Commissioners, every visitor wants to try some local seafood when they visit Massachusetts, don't they? But
That's what they come here for.
Exactly.
Or at least should.
So I'd like to introduce Director.
Could I just interrupt you, Jill,
Yes.
before you, would you expand on that task force a little bit? Is that something that you're setting up? Is that already, say a little more about that?
So this task force is something that, yes, the Mass Gaming Commission is going to be setting up, and we are starting to invite other state agencies that support businesses or have relationships with business to act as resources. So, for example, if any of the applicants are interested in making connections with local seafood companies, the Division of Marine Fisheries has agreed to be a resource.
Okay. So this is something that you're pulling together.
That's right.
That's great. That's what we've been waiting for. But I would like, and I bet others would too, maybe you were involved in this already, Commissioner Stebbins, but I'd like to have an outline pretty soon about what you have in mind, how it
Sure.
works, and give us an opportunity to brainstorm about it.
Sure.
So as soon as you can, I'd like to have that be on the agenda for something we can talk about.
Very good. I'd be pleased to come back.
Okay.
So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Director Paul Diodati and Story Reed, an analyst from the Division of Marine Fisheries. And the Department of Fisheries has also invited Laura Foley Ramsden, owner of Foley Fish Company, to represent the Commonwealth seafood industry, and she will join in a few minutes. But, Director?
Thank you, Jill.
Hey, Paul.
Hey, Good morning. Good morning, Chairman Crosby, and good morning, Commissioner Stebbins. Nice to see you both again, and nice to meet the other commissioners who I don't know. But as Jill indicated, I'm Paul Diodati, and I'm Director of our state's Division of Marine Fisheries. The division is the state fisheries agency responsible for managing our marine fisheries resources, although we do a fair amount of advocacy and marketing programs for the Commonwealth's industries as well. We're part of a larger Department of Fish and Game headed by Commissioner Mary Griffin, who apologizes for not being able to be here this morning, but Commissioner Griffin will be available in the future to assist the Commission in any way possible. In addition to managing our state's local fisheries, the division's involved at federal, interstate, and international levels in many councils, commissions, and other similar conventions. As Jill indicated, we're joined here by one of our fisheries analysts, Story Reed, who's going to give the broader overview of a presentation of our fisheries, and by Laura Ramsden, as she was indicated, one of the owners of Foley Fish. And just about that, Foley Fish has been a Boston-based seafood company here for over 100 years. So it's a familiar sight.
All the fish don't I look good? 7 years now.
It's a familiar sight to see a Foley Fish truck running through the streets of Boston. Laura is also one of Governor Patrick's appointments to the New England Fisheries Management Council and serves as a council member, which is the federal body responsible for providing the management conservation programs for our federal fisheries. That's about all I'm going to say. For now, I'll ask Story to begin his presentation, unless you have any immediate questions or comments, and then we'll answer some questions. And Laura will follow up with a short presentation as well, if that's okay.
No, I would just say welcome.
Thank you.
Commissioner Director Diodati. We've had a pleasure of working together in the past.
We
and
certainly have.
You're a great advocate for the industry, and it's good to have you here.
Nice to see you again, Chairman. So, Story, why don't you begin?
Thanks, Paul, and thanks again, Commissioners, Mr. Chairman, for having us here to do this presentation. A look around the Commonwealth at, various landmarks, including the codfish hanging in the House chamber at the State House, the man at the wheel in Gloucester, shows you how steeped in tradition of the Commonwealth the fishing industry is. It's a part of our history, it's part of our culture, and it's still a large part of the economy of Massachusetts. In fact, the Commonwealth is the second-ranked state in the nation in terms of landings value of seafood behind Alaska. And as we said, it's a destination for tourists, both to come to taste our seafood, but also to come recreationally fish. So we'll talk a little bit about that. What you see in this slide is a measure of the economic impact of the commercial seafood industry, and the red line on the bottom shows over time the ex-vessel value by year of the fishery. And by that we mean this is the price, this is the amount paid to the fishermen by the dealers. So seafood dealers report to us what they pay the fishermen. And so that's the tally on the bottom by year. And in 2012, that was approaching about $600 million paid directly to the harvesters by seafood dealers in Massachusetts. Now that fish is coming from both state waters and federal waters. This is just a measure of it being landed in Massachusetts. And then if you look at...
Are these inflation-adjusted dollars?
They are adjusted to $2012,
Yeah.
good question. And what the blue line is using a 3.1 economic multiplier, which is kind of a conservative, generally agreed upon multiplier on what the economic impact is of those ex-vessel landings. And that's approaching $2 billion in 2012. So it's a significant impact to the economy.
So that would take into account the retail price?
Correct.
What else?
The shoreside businesses, ice, fuel, ship channels.
All the cost of getting
all
it
the
to
cost
market.
of getting that product. And
I wonder if you're going to get into this, but what happened during the 90s that is now being reversed?
It's a good question. What's driving the landings value in the Commonwealth right now is the sea scallop industry that's really picked up since around late 90s, early 2000s, and you'll see that in a few slides. The value of our sea scallop industry is really driving this. What you see in the 90s there is a decline both in the sea scallop landings value and groundfish and a few other things.
If I may,
Sure,
the
please.
stocks crashed in the late 80s, early 90s, and that's also about the time the Sustainable Fisheries Act was enacted. So that we went through a growth period during that time where, you know, we locked down on fishing and put a large series of restrictions in place. Unfortunately, we've seen growth from that, and sea scallops would be a wonderful example of a fully rebuilt fishery, and with actual dollars coming back to that industry in great multiples. But the 90s, early 90s in particular, were a particularly tough time for industry and fishermen.
Okay, the employment impact of the industry, and these numbers of jobs are taken from a recent study put out by NOAA Fisheries Office of Science and Technology, and this is for the 2011 calendar year. And they're estimating that the total number of jobs created by the seafood industry in Massachusetts is close to 100,000 jobs. And it breaks down roughly how they have it below in terms of fishermen, the harvesters, around 13,000. Then you get down to the dealers and the number of jobs they create. Importers, clearly there's a lot of seafood imported into Massachusetts. It's then processed and distributed, so those importers do contribute to that 100,000 number. And then you have the seafood wholesalers and distributors. Those are the dealers. And then the retail jobs, the fish markets, the supermarkets that sell those, the restaurants, I think, are included in that number that all retail seafood. This is an interesting slide that visually depicts the value of the total value of the landings in the top 10 ports in Massachusetts in 2012. So what you see here right off the bat is New Bedford being number one at $411 million, and that is largely driven by the sea scallop industry. Most of those landings are in New Bedford and Fairhaven for the sea scallop industry. There's also some groundfish in there and others, but it's really sea scallops that are driving that number.
And is that number the same as in the red line on that earlier chart?
Yes, that's included. Yeah. And then Gloucester is still a major hub at number 2, 57 million, being driven by groundfish, and that's our number 1 lobster landing port in the state. But the other take-home here is that this is, the landings of seafood throughout the Commonwealth are spread out. They're not just in 1 or 2 ports. They're still spread out in smaller communities like Scituate, Provincetown, Barnstable, Sandwich, and this is only the top 10. There's still a significant lobster fishery in Rockport, Beverly, Salem. So this is really spread out throughout the Commonwealth.
How does New Bedford rank nationally?
Number 1.
Number 1. Wow.
Because of sea scallops.
For sea scallops.
And it has been for more than a half dozen years now.
For sea scallops or for the total?
It's for the total, but it's driven by sea
Yeah,
scallops.
okay.
And groundfish, just to clarify that, includes a complex of species that are cod, haddock, and your more popular flounders. We refer to those as groundfish. They manage as a complex.
The sea scallops are only indigenous to our waters. There isn't a West Coast or a Gulf equivalent, so that helps New England.
This is just a table showing that by value the top 6 commercial species in 2012 in the Commonwealth. So you see the sea scallop clearly at the top, 364 million. But there's also a diversity of species here, including shellfish and finfish and lobster. So we do have a diverse local seafood landings.
So is there no West Coast scallop? It's a...
Well, they have a bay, but not a sea.
Okay.
They have like a singing scallop up in the Seattle
Singing
area.
scallop.
Yes, yes, you might want to travel to see.
And it's quite subordinate in terms
Right.
of level of landings and value. We should point out that the American lobster, which we're all familiar with, is the most valuable state waters fishery that we have. Lots of that landings come within 3 miles of the shore.
Is that sea scallop yield sustainable?
It has been, and it's a very successful fishery, and it's managed under a sustainable fisheries management plan. So far, we're demonstrating that we're maintaining levels, but there are ups and downs, but they're slight. We seem to have smoothed out those peaks and valleys.
If I may, I serve on the Scallop Committee for the New England Fishery Management Council, and it's been completely impressive to me how tightly industry, and we're not a scallop processor, so I'm not speaking of myself, but industry and science have worked hand in hand, and in fact, the scallopers come to the council and say, give us a reduction, it's taking too long to harvest this many scallops from this fishing ground, it's called CPUE, so catch per unit effort. It's too high right now, and it's gonna do damage to the smaller juvenile scallops. So for instance, we've reduced their catch by 29% this year, which is driving price, making it harder for me to sell scallops, but it's better for the resource. So, but they know that if they reduce now in 2013, their catch levels are likely to be better in 2015. And they're definitely aided by the fact that scallops don't move much. And so they're really able to go in and get a finite count of what is happening on the different scallop beds, so that they really understand how much can come out of the water on any given time. That's something that we don't have as much of a luxury on the groundfish. So they're very protective of their resource, and like I said, the scientists and the industry really work hand in hand, taking reductions, asking for special access trips to be rotated into areas that are more plentiful, even if it means giving up trips, just to make sure they don't want to hurt the golden goose, if you will.
Is
that-
that, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
You may be saying the same thing. Go ahead.
I was going to say, is that also true of the management of the cod fishery?
Well, the management of the cod fishery has been very difficult, as I'm sure if you read the papers. We took a 78% reduction in cod landings.
This was the federal council.
The federal council
Right.
in January. And so the issues with cod are very complicated, and that we're not sure whether it's water temperature pushing them further north. If you look at the biomass in a place like Iceland, it's the highest they've ever seen. So we don't know what's happening, and it's not all related to fishing, but we are ratcheting down the one thing that we can control, which
Right.
unfortunately is
Right.
the fishing.
Right.
Is the model of the success of managing the scallops, is that helpful in the other fisher,
You know,
fisherman categories?
Yeah, I'll
See
say a
that
little bit about that.
understand in the long run, this is gonna help?
Yeah.
I know there's tremendous resistance.
We actually have a very unique situation with sea scallops, and actually, nationally, the Division of Marine Fisheries has this special partnership with the 5 campuses of the University of Massachusetts, and through what we call the Massachusetts Fisheries Institute. And through that body, the University of Massachusetts, SMAS in particular at UMass Dartmouth, has developed a program of cooperatively surveying the scallop beds on George's Bank with the fishermen, using fishing vessels as their platform. The fishermen contribute a very costly amount, by the way, for the survey time and supplies needed to do that. And the survey is unique in that it actually photographs what's on the bottom. So we get a real-time count of what's out there from year to year. And that's difficult to duplicate, but
Yeah.
we're currently working today with traditionally the way we've surveyed other types of fish is by catching them in nets, bring them on board, counting them, and so forth. Well, now we're applying specially designed cameras that takes stereo images of these fish, measures them, and enumerates them with infrared lasers. And so we're going to drag nets but not catch any fish. We'll be imaging them and doing something very similar as we did with the sea scallop survey. And so it's a few years away, I think, before we can implement and do that, but it's going to be, I think, a turning point for the way we assess the condition of the stocks. We can cover more area. We don't have to stop and start the trawl, pick up the fish and count them. We can just keep going and take a look at these fish without having any impact of passive survey. in a sense. So, yeah,
Probably get NSA to help you collect data on that.
we'll take any help we can get, including from the Gaming
And
Commission.
there'll be more buy-in from the fishermen as well, because when you said there's resistance, I think that there isn't resistance to doing the right thing in the fishing community from all the comments I hear at the meetings that we attend. There's resistance to buy-in sometimes on the science, because they say, that's great, you dragged the net at that time, you took 2 tows in November, and now you're gonna say, we've got an issue, so, because it's so different from what they may be seeing in the ocean.
Right.
So what Paul's talking about will lead to just more belief
Yeah.
in what's coming out, and may actually change what's coming out, and that's what they have had the luxury of having in the scallop industry with the half cam.
Yeah, fascinating.
We've talked a lot about the sea scallops, so I won't stick on this slide too long. But the bottom line, I guess, for consumers, that there's a relatively steady supply. It is a relatively costly product, but consumers love it. So, and there's a steady supply, so it's good for consumers, retailers, and restaurants.
All of the shucking is done by hand, right?
Yes, it is.
That's right.
So all 300 million pounds are
Shucked at sea
Shucked.
most of it.
And it's done at sea aboard the vessels.
Really?
Which could be a 2-week trip, or longer in some cases, but.
Up to 17,000-ish meat
They are
pounds a
well
trip.
compensated for their
Yeah.
shucking.
Yes.
Current market values, everyone wants to get out there and shuck.
That's why it costs $10 a pound.
It's hard to get one of those
Costs right
spots.
$13 a pound.
Yes.
yeah,
Right.
Yes.
Is it hourly or is it piecework?
It's basically
It's
a trip,
yeah, it's trip
trip-based,
value.
so
Oh, I
you
see.
get a share.
Everybody gets shares.
That's right.
Uh-huh.
Is there anything you could do with the shells? Can you recycle the shells somehow or other?
They
Any
have
value?
been, there's all types of recycling programs that have been established, not only for sea scallop shells, but shellfish in general.
Right.
You'll see them in driveways,
Yeah.
Right.
remanufactured into
Yeah. Be nice if you
paving
could figure out a
material.
value to the shell as well. that
Yeah,
is.
and some fertilizers as well.
And then on to the lobster, which we talked a little bit about. Catches have been increasing in the Commonwealth over the past 5 years. We're at about 14 million plus pounds were landed in 2012. So there's a steady supply for consumers. It's definitely an increased supply in the summer and fall, and that's when the price is lowest. I think what you hear the lobstermen complaining about a lot is that people think this is a luxury item when you see it at Market Basket for $5 a pound. So when the price does go down, as it has for the past several years, this time of year, for a number of reasons, including the increased supply, it is available for consumers, and it is relatively inexpensive. You know, they like to say, eat a lobster, save a hot dog. You know, I've seen that bumper sticker around Gloucester, so.
In Boston.
Yeah, Gloucester's a unique place, that's where I'm based out of. There's also been increased retail sales by lobstermen as they try to get more value out of their products, so they, you know, maybe the dealers don't like this, but they're finding little niche markets where they can sell directly to the consumer. We allow them to do it through a retail boat dealer permit, so there's a little bit more of that. So again, people now like to see where their seafood's coming from, so if they buy from the lobsterman directly, it's kind of a neat thing, and it's happening a little bit more. We see a spike in those types of permits that we're issuing.
Is the price during these months high enough to sustain the
Very-
cost of
It's
harvest?
marginal.
It's
That's
very
what you
marginal.
ask, Right.
Yes.
Cost of diesel's up, the cost of bait is up 3 or
Right.
4-fold
Right.
over the past few years.
Right.
There's a lot of increased costs, and so it's tough for them.
All right.
And you've seen in Maine, their catches are way up too, and they've had shutdowns. They're kind of in a little bit disarray with the price. It's worse than ours, I think.
All right.
Then the eastern oyster, I think when ag was here, you heard a little bit about the burgeoning aquaculture industry in Massachusetts, and it really is an emerging industry right now. The harvest of oysters in Massachusetts has doubled since 2008, and that's largely because of aquaculture. There's not a whole lot of wild harvest of oysters in Massachusetts, but it's a product that consumers want. Raw bars, fried oysters, there's a high demand for it. It's available year-round for the most part, with a slight decrease in the winter. The aquaculture industry is very well organized. They have a good association. We participate in some of their meetings, listen to some of their concerns, but I think this is a segment of the fishery that's really growing. So it's a product that's readily available.
We, in my dad's generation, we had 2 oysters. One was from New York and one was from Connecticut, the Long Island Sound Blue Point oyster. And now, on any given day, we have 13 different oysters, with the majority of them, maybe 2 are from Maine, but the majority of them are Cape Cod oysters. And it's so interesting to see how the different flavor and size profiles are truly evident depending on which part of the Cape they're coming off of, or out of Duxbury. And our customers across the country definitely value that.
What different, are they different species, or what?
No, it's all
differenti-
the same species, Crassoteris virginica. Forgive, my Latin teacher will not forgive me for that. But they're all the same, but it really is water temperature, it's abundance of feed, it's salinity of the water, it's
Right.
length of time in the beds. It's really, if you think about like a vineyard,
Yeah.
grapes tasting different, there are
That's what I was
slight,
thinking, yeah.
subtle nuances
Yeah.
with the oysters.
Amazing.
Yeah, it is really neat.
Where are these, these farms, if you will?
Sure, there are.
Whereabouts? All over,
All over Cape Cod,
Cape Cod?
Duxbury,
Yeah.
Island Creek Oyster in Duxbury. I think they have a restaurant in Boston now, right? So really from the South Shore down to the Cape. And Buzzards Bay has
Yes.
bay scallops, and
Mhm.
it's also quahogs that are clams, that are hard-shell clams that are being farmed as well.
And Wellfleet has
Wellfleet.
the fish
Mussels.
clam
Mussels.
business as well. The Wellfleet clams are quite well known, and they're distinguished with a special ring, which is nice because their shells are distinguishable. So if you're out in the middle of Missouri, you know it's a Wellfleet clam. You know, you kind of fall into that. Every menu says Chatham cod, or every menu says a diver's cod. These clams have sort of a distinguished marking on them, so you really know that they are the Wellfleet clam.
Fascinating.
It's neat.
Does the aquaculture piece extend to fish as well? You
Not-
kind
not
of
as-
include that in your industry sector?
Yeah. Well, we certainly include it where it exists, but there hasn't been the economic success that there has been with shellfish. Shellfish is really the emerging industry and the one that we're most optimistic about for aquaculture. Growing finfish seems to require much more controls and space. And coastal properties are difficult to acquire in a state that's highly populated, like Massachusetts. Acquire at an economic, a reasonable economic fee. So we're not seeing a lot of aquaculture on finfish. That does take place is typically done in a land-based operation. A lot of times it's freshwater species or hybrids of different species. But we're not seeing a lot of that yet, but there's always entrepreneurs and researchers that are testing the waters with that type of initiative.
A fish farm just went out of business this past week in New York, which had been sort of a poster child and was being featured, their species were being featured in big chains, I mean Wegmans and Price Chopper, and it just went out of business. I think that, as Paul said, it's much more difficult, and capital would be the thing that's lacking in addition to ocean space. I mean, if you think of an oyster or a clam, you're talking 30, 40, 50, 60 cents. So if there's a blight, if there's a warm water temperature and you have to reseed, you don't have financial ruin. Whereas we're talking big dollars when, in terms of feed costs and the actual cost of the fish, when you lose harvest. So it's much harder to raise fish.
Thanks.
In addition to some of these species that are available primarily year-round, we also have some seasonal offerings, or for a number of reasons, these fish are only available at certain times in Massachusetts, and that's either because of their migratory patterns and/or they're managed by a strict quota. So we open the fishery on a certain date, and then once by dealer landings, we see that we're about to reach 100% of the Commonwealth's quota, we have to shut that fishery down. So black sea bass, striped bass, summer flounder or fluke, and northern shrimp are examples of some of these seasonal offerings. For instance, our striped bass commercial fishery opened this year, July 14th, and we met our quota about a week and a half ago. So, but the point here is that there is some different products, some different seafood that's available seasonally that.
What's happened to bluefish? I haven't seen it on the menu anywhere.
Sure.
It's year-round.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
but
it's
I-
almost,
I haven't seen it on the menu. I thought maybe something had happened to it.
no, it's still here. We do have a quota, but generally it lasts most of the year because
Not
it's a pretty
very-
high quota.
It's, speaking as someone trying to sell bluefish, it's a very affordable fish, but the darker meat
Yeah.
and the higher oil content makes it less palatable nationwide. But that being said, I mean, a local retailer like Rich Brothers, they just ran it on special 2 weeks ago. So it is definitely available.
Yeah.
But the bigger box retailers that go through warehouses, it's too perishable a fish. And it's not landed in quantities where you can put it in 100 chain stores. So you
Yeah,
don't see it
interesting, yeah.
at your Shaws and Stop and Shops of
Yeah,
the world.
interesting.
It's-
But I haven't, was it McCormick and Schmick's, and it wasn't
Yeah.
on the menu?
Yeah, because it's a national
'Cause that's-
chain,
oh,
so their
okay, same
buyers
thing.
wouldn't.
Yeah,
That's,
interesting.
that's sort of some of the things that we come up against.
Interesting. Yeah.
It's very highly available to recreational fishermen as well, and so
Right.
it's one of those fish that if you're fishing in the ocean, you're likely going to bring home a bluefish during
Yeah.
the summer, and so it makes it less valuable in the marketplace.
And some use it as bait for the bigger fish.
Yes, they do.
Oh, really?
That I know.
Yeah, it's common tuna bait.
Exactly, which one seasonal species that's not on here is bluefin tuna that Paul just mentioned, and that's certainly a species that's landed in Massachusetts in the summertime. A lot of that fish is exported, but it is available fresh in the Commonwealth from June through October,
At least, yeah.
for the most part. And there's your bluefish pictured in the affordable and available species
Oh, all
slide.
right, thank you.
So there are emerging markets for some of these healthy and underutilized species, and they do include bluefish, redfish, monkfish, and dogfish. There's generally a steady supply of these fish, and on the right, you've got dogfish coming up on a long line.
So that's a dogfish on a hook on each one of those?
Yes.
Yes, it is.
That's an amazing picture.
And it's a pretty clean way to catch dogfish. It takes good care of them coming up. They're not in a net.
Of course, they meant to be getting swordfish, and they're a little sad, all those
No.
dogs on the line. No,
And they're probably trying to get codfish, but no, they're available, and we have a high quota now of dogfish. A lot of dogfish is exported to the EU. It's used in fish and chips and products like that in Europe. So there really isn't much of a market domestically.
There isn't.
So that's a species that could be used.
it's tough because dogfish don't garner a big dollar value at port, and so there isn't great incentive for the fishermen to take super great care of it out at sea in terms of icing, so the quality doesn't tend to be that good. So, plus they're very labor intensive to cut. So it does end up being a fish that's sort of frozen in bulk and exported rather than being marketed to the domestic community. But there are certainly opportunities, and there are chefs that are trying to promote it.
Moving forward with Massachusetts seafood, and I think Laura can speak to some of this as well, but Massachusetts seafood, as we discussed, can be marketed as local, high quality. There's a new movement in the past few years to market the traceability of fish, knowing where it came from boat through the dealer to your plate or to the retail establishment. It's a real new way to market seafood and other products, and I think Laura might be able to speak to that a little bit more if you want to know later. But yeah, that's one way to market Massachusetts seafood, as being local. In terms of finding local seafood dealers, we do maintain on our website an up-to-date list of seafood dealers who are authorized to purchase certain species directly from fishermen. So anybody can look that up and get their contact information. Where this list is lacking is it has no measure of activity. So a dealer may get a permit with us and ask for the permission to purchase these species, but we don't know if they're, based on this list, whether they're active or not. So Laura might be able to speak to also how you can get in touch with seafood dealers and processors. One thing that definitely shouldn't be overlooked in our seafood industry is the recreational fishing industry. It's a big industry in Massachusetts. Some measures have it over $1 billion. That 2011 NOAA study that I referenced earlier says that it creates 5,300 jobs, and I would say that's probably low if you think about all the tackle shops, gas pumps, marinas that benefit from this industry. The map on the right of this slide is one that's from our website and shows where tackle shops exist throughout the Commonwealth. But people can go fishing on their own in their private boats from public access sites on the shoreline, or the many charter boats that are scattered around the Commonwealth that take people out for everything from bluefin tuna to cod to striped bass to bluefish. And I think we got a little shot in the arm in the past few years with the advent of the television program Wicked Tuna, which you see here, Captain Dave Marciano. That has brought people into our office in Gloucester to find out where they can find these boats, how they can get a charter trip, and we've definitely seen an increase in the people that want to go out in their own private boats and try to catch a bluefin tuna. So it's interesting that these television shows, these reality shows, are really drumming up interest in this industry in Massachusetts. I think we saw it with The Perfect Storm 10 years ago, and now this show is really building up the interest of tourism in the seafood industry. So it's an interesting thing.
Cheers before that.
That's right.
That's right.
Beer and fish, what's better?
So that,
Says the Irish girl.
that's really what we have for our presentation, unless there's any questions. I think Laura can add a few things from her perspective.
So I prepared a presentation, sort of a brief overview, blind to what stories readers doing. So there's some crossover, so I won't bore you with anything you've already heard. Just a brief introduction. As Paul said, I am the fourth generation Foley, running Foley Fish. And when my parents came and said we want to transact this business, we took a hard look at the state of the industry and the oceans and the competitors and the fishery management that was going on to say, is this a smart business to go into? And based on what we found, we said, yes, there's definitely a future and a chance for a fifth generation, though don't tell my children that because I don't think that's their career plan, though Charlie has worked the past couple summers packing fish. I put on the cover of your presentation a map of showing where Massachusetts is and just highlighting the different fishing grounds where we pull fish. And my great-grandfather was an immigrant from the county Tipperary in Ireland, and they say that the first son gets the farm, and he was the second son. So when he came to Boston and joined a cousin in the fish business, this sort of became, he thought of this as his farm, if you will. And we really do have a bountiful harvest here in New England. And it troubles me when the media talks a lot about disaster and the end of the demise of the fishing industry, because if we look at the numbers, the biomass in full is actually growing thanks to the strict fishery management measures that have been in place. The problem is maybe it's not exactly the species that we want. We may have more dogfish than we do have codfish. But unfortunately, when you are in a multiplex ecosystem, we don't always get to pick and choose which species are growing at what rate, and we have haddock at record levels, but juvenile haddock will eat juvenile cod. So there is going to be some balance that goes on, and we're under a law that says that all species have to be at the same level at the same time. And I think whoever wrote it might have missed bio class because it's a little tricky to do that. So I wanted to say that we are located here in midst of these beautiful fishing grounds that are well managed, that do yield incredible amounts of seafood of all diverse types. And so I spend a lot of my time, we sell into 38 states with over 500 customers, and we look at numbers, 87% of imported seafood, and we say, hell no, let's get New England seafood on the menus. Let's fight for menu share for our fish right here, shellfish and fish in retail cases and on menus throughout the country. And when I think about casinos coming in, I mean, we were the first order into the MGM Grand in Las Vegas, and we sell a gaming company down in Birmingham, Alabama. But those people are crying about shipping rates, and I think, oh my goodness, you could have something right here where you can get all of this amazing, well-managed seafood without having to pay $2 a pound to UPS or American Airlines. It could be right at your door every single day, and that's really exciting for us. So I just went through, and again, it's very similar to what you just saw, but sort of in a consolidated, you see a list of fish that are available year-round. You see a list of shellfish that are available year-round, and then you see seasonal opportunities. And it's very, for us, we talk to our customers about menu planning, and we talk to them about Mother Nature or the government providing seasonal opportunities through closures or openings. But you can basically build an entire menu from appetizer, I haven't quite figured out how to work dessert into it, but appetizer, soup, salad, dinner, entree, just using New England fish, thanks to the bountiful harvest. So I just included in the study availability of the majority of them. Just again, some photos like you just saw on the slides. These are a variety of the New England groundfish that are available. These are Jonah cocktail claws. People think they have to get the Florida stone crab claws. These are harvested right here alongside the lobster, and they're half the price of a Florida stone crab claw, and you don't have the shipping on top of it. So, really exciting things that a casino or restaurant affiliated with a casino could put onto their menus without ever having to step out of the state of Massachusetts. Oysters, these are the Wellfleet clams. I talked about the distinguished markings on them. You can see to know that you are getting a real Massachusetts clam. Jasper White, a famous chef in Massachusetts, has done a great job with the steamer clam, something that's not found on menus, really truly differentiable items that they're not going to get in Vegas, that they can get right here in Massachusetts. The mussels we didn't talk about, but there are both a wild and farm mussel opportunities here. Skipping a page. Of course, no one says no to lobster, again, harvested right here in New England. And then the scallops that we've talked about. So you see that's a cheesecloth bag, and they mark the days that they come in. So that's day 11 of a 12-day trip in the harvest that you see, again, that has all been shucked at sea. The last page, I just point your attention to, because we are fighting for menu share and we want to give credit to the local fishermen. I mean, I sit in these council meetings, and these men and women that are out risking their lives every day are really, they're bringing in amazing product, and yet they're getting pushed to the side of menus for fish like tilapia that's being imported, or other fish that are coming from further abroad. And we want to say, further afield, we want to say, hey, let's really promote what's being landed locally, so that in the middle of Kansas, you can see the fishing boat, the method of catch, the captain's name, the area that it was harvested. So what we're doing now for all of our local fish is when someone gets an invoice from Foley Fish, they'll have a code at the bottom of it, and they can then translate that to a QR code and put it on menus or in their retail cases, and then their smartphone will give them data about where it was harvested, how it was harvested, what fishing grounds. And then we had an intern spend the last summer collecting, we have over 250 vessel photos in our bank, in our data bank, so that we're able to demonstrate that this was caught by a Massachusetts or I should say a New England fishermen, but the majority of these species are being landed right here in the New England ports. So
That's great.
That's really.
that's what I have for you.
That's great, that's great, that's great.
Any questions on
well,
processing?
I have a feeling that, I don't have to tell you this, but we have been very aggressive about talking to the industry, the casino industry, saying we want to use local everything, employers, suppliers. That's what Jill's job is not only to make sure that they're sensitive to that, but that we prepare the market well enough so that there are suppliers who are ready to do the work. But they are now putting together their proposals to persuade us that they should be the licensees, and one of the sets of criteria is economic development, and within that is use of local suppliers and so forth. So now is the time, and this is everybody, and it's not just Foley, but for people to be very proactive, knock on every door, because now is when the leverage is there to get them to say, yes, we're buying locally, and make commitments to do such and such. So somebody had said, Paul might have said something about Jill, when the casino companies come to you, and I'm just thinking, don't wait for them to come to,
Right.
Reach out and make sure that they are fashioning local purchasing strategies now, because now is the time of maximum development of these strategies. Anybody else? It's fascinating. Great.
Well, thank you for having us on behalf of the entire industry, thank you.
Yeah.
And we're available, and I look forward to working on the task force that's going on.
Great.
so.
Great, thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for coming in.
Of course. It's warmer than the fish plant.
Right, yeah.
Now I'm hungry.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah, you could have brought in some samples.
We thought about it, we didn't have, I should have made some smoked salmon. That
Yeah,
would be
there you go.
really
A
good.
breakfast menu, right?
Yeah. Thanks again. Okay, Director Day,
I may not.
you're what?
I'm gathering a pointer.
Oh, I've got one.
We got it. Thanks.
Overall administrative topics?
Morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Morning.
Good morning.
Just, I have an initial, I guess, a heads-up reminder as we look to September 4th will be our next meeting, but it will also be at Priam at 84 State Street. It's a little smaller space than we're used to, so I think it's probably appropriate just to encourage those that attend. If it works as well to watch via the stream, it might be a little bit easier to fit in that space. So just thought it'd be worth mentioning that as we move forward.
We're only doing that because these other spaces aren't available. so-
That's correct, yes. Let me talk briefly about a couple of general administrative details. Our evaluation process manager coordinator has started work, and we anticipate a proposed outline about the process from Pink & Company as part of our review of our planned process review at our first meeting in September. In addition, our procurement teams listened to oral presentations from potential building and site design advisors yesterday, and have oral presentations for economic advisors set for next week. And at this point, we and still anticipate bringing forward final proposals to the commission at the September 4th meeting. Other good news, we've narrowed our CIO, our information officer, chief information officer, to the top 5, and we are looking forward to interview of those finalists beginning the first week in September. And finally, in this area, we've identified our chief financial and accounting officer finalist, and we have started the background investigation before we make our final offers. In addition, I'd like to take us to a little bit of a discussion regarding the master schedule, and the topic of the master schedule discussion will be a little bit different because we'll be talking about organizational development. And our goal is to be staffed and fully trained in time for when the casino construction is complete, which sounds fairly straightforward. However, the major challenge is going to be as we look forward to the slot license award, slot license become operational. The key is to be ready for the licensing needs of the slot parlor and the quicker needs of the regulatory apparatus, but still don't staff up for that, but on the other hand, don't staff up to the point that we have a lot of people on board with nothing to do. So it just adds a little bit more complexity to the development of our organization today. What I'll do is start briefly and talk with the commissioners about the schedule. And I'll start with this area up here, which is really the summary schedule at the top of the chart. And what the summary schedule does is it looks to provide a big picture, not much detail behind it. But a primary issue is right in at the top, which is the initial, it's green, red, and blue. But what it is the construction side. And what we're tying the organizational development to is a construction timetable, which is purely an estimate. And a lot of our initial discussion here is more estimate, and more facts have to come into being before we can be really positive.
What was the source of that estimate? That was one thing it's basically, you've got 808 days, right?
Right, we're about 11, we're estimating about 11 months for the slot parlor and about 24 months for the casino construction. And, Mr. Chairman, the estimates come from a couple places, everything from the informal rumor to the consultants' reports, and then to practical experience of other states. So I've tried to pick some areas in between that. And I might note as we move forward that that's casino construction complete, and it's a lot different from that perspective when we're talking about the resorts. And
Right. Oh, so this is casino construction complete?
casino construction,
Oh, interesting. Okay.
it's all the casinos, it's 24 months, but the part of the question is I think it's probably pretty firm that there will be ongoing construction once the casinos themselves are
Right.
complete. And that's part of the process we have to, the commissioners will need to look at in the regulation process, is that whole, once the casino is actually up and ready to run, what's the operational, what's the approval process, how long is that going to be, and the other factors that the commission's going to take into consideration, how much of the rest of the resort, the infrastructure has to be available before a
Right.
licensee would be able to go in business.
Right. That's something we've never even discussed, I don't think.
Correct.
Right. Well, right, but in addition, it's important to highlight that when we talk construction, it's not, it includes permitting, design, and construction. When we talk about it in this context,
Yeah.
which could vary quite a bit among proposals. So we will see, because they are very site-specific issues and
Right.
and things like that, we will see, once we get the proposals, just how developers are thinking about them.
Correct. And we have and even with the slots parlor here, I mean, part of that discussion is the award of the license is actually coming in the winter. So the first 3 months is not necessarily a real hot construction period, so it can depend to make that difference too, maybe ultimately longer. That might be pretty optimistic.
Right.
And the commission is poised, though, as it begins its evaluation process, will actually see more detail relative to this timeline and what the applicants are proposing, which I'm also very conscious of here. So I look forward to their proposals as to how that timeline might move forward. We did up here, part, notice right in the middle here, it's the black line, is a construction monitoring phase. And that's something we haven't discussed too much detail as well, but it'll be another item of regulatory policy that we'll have to move forward. That's the concept that once we have the award, which will start with a slot partner, the expectations and process the commission would have to monitor that construction and what particularly might be the deliverables that the commission will be looking at as we move forward with at least the commission-style monitoring. So what we have here in this middle section is more the organizational side as well, and the regulation and enforcement, or IAB really, is the orange. Licensing is blue, and general administration is green. The concept here, as we move forward, is trying to find when these units need to be, or these parts of the organization need to be fully operational as we move forward with the time. So IAB, the basic theory here is it needs to be fully operational when the casinos are ready to open. Now, there's but-ifs in between, so it's not quite that easy, but essentially we want to make sure that IAB is prepared as the casinos open to be able to do the pre-opening inspection and final process to make sure the casinos, if they're ready to go, and the commission is prepared to approve, that they can go ahead into business without being slowed up by the agency. Licensing division is blue. The overall goal here too is directed toward the casino resorts. Will have the largest number of employees, but are at least opening is going to be a couple of years out. So what that means is licensing has to be prepared relative to the slots parlor licensing that might take place, and I'll touch on that briefly as we go forward. But in the end, that demand for them is going to reach its peak as the casinos are getting ready to open, which may be essentially 3, maybe 4 months before the casinos are actually operational. And of course, we have here as well is the development of the research project, which is dark red, is well underway, and will, as we know, will continue past the opening process. I'll comment briefly, this part of the chart just gives us a little bit more detail about what we've talked about with projected timelines and casino, the slots part of the casino opening. And then when we follow up on as we move forward with the charts, we'll see that we're beginning to put in place the pieces that we will need to bring up the organization. So this, of course, is the research project, and I'm going to be very wise here. I know this part of the process right over here is the immediate focus, which is the baseline surveys to kind of get the prevalence rates and those kind of things. And I know there are many others that are better with this part of the chart than I am, including the chairman, if he had any particular comments. But that part of our chart is pretty well developed. The staff done real well.
And Mark is involved in this and working with this?
Yes, yes.
He's
Director
presumably starting to...
Vanderlinden is very involved with it, and
Right.
as he is with the research
Right.
research project and the monitoring as the
Right.
project itself moves forward.
This doesn't particularly relate to the schedule, but I did want to bring it up. It just came up yesterday. I thought it was really interesting. We had a meeting yesterday of the group we're going to do. You remember we had this long discussion about two different kinds of longitudinal research studies. One is a cross-sectional study, one is a cohort study. And we decided that the priority for us and what the legislature envisioned as the priority was the cross-sectional study, which is what our UMass Amherst-based team had proposed. But we had always agreed that a cohort study was also important, and a cohort study basically takes a snapshot of a group of individuals and tracks those individuals over time to see what happens to them and how they evolve and where problem gambling comes from and how treatments work and so forth. But you begin to become unrepresentative of the Commonwealth as the Commonwealth changes, but we're just tracking that same cohort. But anyway, we had a meeting yesterday to start the conversation going about the cohort study, which we're going to start pretty soon. And a topic that came up was what we've heard a little bit, that there are various ways to screen individuals to determine whether or not they are problem gamblers or pathological gamblers. There typically is a whole host of potential indicators, anxiety about gambling too much, those kinds of things. But there are 3 or 4 different research methodologies that will determine how many of those indicators you have to have as positives before you're considered either problem gambling or pathological gambling. So what it means is you get the different data because they're using different methodologies. The analysis of problem gambling as a medical condition, I think we've all heard, it's now accepted by the whatever it's called, American Psychological Association or something, as a formal DSM, a formal diagnostic condition. And there's an opportunity now to come up with a common standard for what the criteria will be for determining problem gambling or pathological gambling. And because we have this huge project going on and we have more resources available to us than anybody else in the U.S., and we're working with NCRG, National Council for Responsible Gaming, which is headquartered right here, we are going to see if we can take on the task of leading the industry, kind of like what Jennifer is doing in the racing industry, trying to pull together a leadership group to lead the industry to come up with a common single standard for what determines problem and pathological gambling, which would be a huge breakthrough for the industry. So it's just an aside, and Mark has now got it on his to-do list, and I wanted to make sure you were aware of it. We might even, in the next few months, have a sort of a mini conference and pull everybody in and debate it and figure out and get all the key players to buy into it and so forth. So it's sort of a tangential effect of what we're doing, but because we have these tools and these priorities that the legislature gave us, it gives us an opportunity to maybe affect the whole macro world of research about problem gambling, which would be a huge, huge step forward for everybody.
Yeah, that sounds terrific. I'm not sure it's tangential, because couldn't it also provide a foundation for when intervention is appropriate and drive other
Yeah,
kinds of
absolutely.
decisions as to what kinds of programs?
And you end up not debating it, right? I mean,
Right.
so everybody agrees that this
Right.
person is a
Right.
problem gambler
Right.
or not, rather than
Right.
debating whether or not they're a
Right.
problem gambler.
Right.
Yeah, it could be, it would be huge in terms of treatment, it would be huge in terms of research and
Right.
so forth, so.
Right.
It's just it's an exciting product of what we're doing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Pleasure.
And with that, I'll just move a little bit forward with our process here this morning. At the bottom of this chart right here is a little bit more detail with the construction modeling. It's basically an estimate, seeing as how we haven't actually dealt with that formally at the commission at this point, but it gives a little bit of a picture, the idea of just a monitoring process that would have quarterly updates before the commission, and essentially a process at the end that would require commission review and approval along with final inspection by staff. This is an option. It's not the only option that might come forward, but it gives a little picture of how that process may occur. On the next page we have is really what I'm going to talk for the most part is the bottom of the chart. The top here is the evaluation process, and we will have another presentation on that whole process as we get December 4th as well, and get our... September 4th, yes. Get our consultant on board.
December 4th, we'll have a history.
That's true. At any rate, well, in this area is just the development of the regulatory and enforcement arm that we're speaking of, and I'll just hit a couple keys to that. First, in this area, what we are beginning in the process of setting up our discussions with the Massachusetts State Police. That's one of the critical roles that will be, we have to kind of firm up how the agencies agree and what we anticipate as we move forward with the rest of the planning process, because that will have a great effect. We'll also have to move into a policy discussion, which will be on our list from the concept of what that regulatory enforcement picture would look like. There's different models, obviously. There's a model that has a complete regulatory arm that's stationed at the casino with a, excuse me, law enforcement arm, kind of side by side. There's also models that basically enforcement staff both fulfill the regulatory tasks as well as the criminal investigative staff. So that's kind of what there's options in between. Excuse me. So that's what we need to, probably one of the big policy discussions that we'll be asking the commission to take a look at anyway, and as we move forward in this process. We'll have some initial visits with the state police, check in to see where they're at with that process. Then as we do that, though, we've got to come back as well, firm up understandings with the Attorney General's office, and then, of course, with the Liquor Control Commission as well. All that foundation has to be taken care of. As we do that part, as we get down in this part of the agenda, we've got our challenge again. We've got to try and make sure our background investigation ability is up and ready to go as we get into the initial licensing process after the slot license is issued. And then as well, we have got to take a look and start moving into our financial investigation unit, or investigation unit as well.
I know you're aware of this, Rick, but if you run a line down from November, which is the opening of the slots, if you run it straight down, it cuts off gambling, regulatory training, financial investigation, analysis staff. It just, you've got some target dates which are after the opening of the slots. And I know you guys are working, this is a conversation you and I have all the time, reflecting my uneducated concern about getting this stuff done on time. But, you know, we really need to be done and ready to go a month or so before anything opens, because we'll slip and miss times and need to shake down cruises and so forth. So I just noticed those dates are outside the.
Well, I'm surprised everybody hasn't caught me on a few other typos in here too as well. So
Yeah.
there's a few things here that we need to find.
And I realize this is very much a draft, and I know you're up to your eyeballs in this, but I just keep reiterating my concern here.
But
Well, I thought the opening of the slots was 1/15.
I thought it was November.
The slots,
Construction slot spoiler, 115, 750.
Oh, all right. That's what, 11 months from December would have been.
December 17th was our projected date,
Right,
so
and it's
it's
11
about
months
11
after
months.
that would have been the end of October.
Was the construction, but then there's 50 days for
Oh, okay. Okay, well,
doing
anyway,
something else, final inspection.
okay.
Well, but it is the driver of a lot of things that we have to do
Right.
relative to, the regulatory
Right.
framework, the testing. I've been thinking a little bit about some of the policy decision that we've talked about relative to having a lab or contracting out or something in between. I think that question may come to fruition, for example, mostly driven by the slot spoiler timeline. We may have, just like we have done with consultants,
Right.
Yeah.
we may have, by necessity, initially start with outside help, but then, as Rick suggested in his initial remarks, ramp up and change that mix. As the
Yeah,
other.
I wasn't disagreeing with that. I was
Yeah,
just-
no, I'm just.
No, first, no, he was
I'm
adjusting.
reiterating.
He's adjusting the dates, which is
Right.
appropriate. But I do, as I said, you and I talk about this all the time, and I think you know stuff that I don't know and that we don't know, and certainly David Acosta knows stuff that we don't know. But I do think that it would be worthwhile, as sort of a next step for this, to make sure that we've really thought through carefully what are the critical path operating variables that have to be hit. How are we going to track the cache? The testing of the machines that are going to go in, whatever, the licensing, obviously, of all the individuals, the surveillance approvals, whatever all the kind of critical things are that are the end points of each of our major regulatory systems that need to be operational. Have we thought about how we're going to get their machines approved? I don't know whether, you probably have thought about that, but I think it would be interesting to have, something where we could all kind of kick it around with the staff as well, just really sort of ground test, truth test, the operating assumptions. Have we really thought through every single critical variable that might trip us up? I'd be doing that, certainly. Any manager would be doing this as you're setting up a big operation, but it's, as I say, this reflects, I'm not familiar with what all those are, so that causes me concern. You may be familiar with all those are, and it doesn't cause you concern, but I think we'd all feel better, having it put up on a piece of paper and we all get to kick it around and just make sure we're not inadvertently missing something.
Well, as a matter of fact, is this part of the chart, part of what we are taking into consideration and sort of the
It's
core
just that.
behind this is those areas.
Absolutely
And they-
right, and I realize that.
They actually come with our regulatory approach too, as we move forward with development of our regulations, and when that has to take place, so we are in a position to do testing. So and the slot parlor is really a driver there, so as we
Right.
move forward, we'll touch on that aspect of licensing regulations and when they have to be. Matter of fact, you took some of my lines away there. The licensing regulations, as we get in the next phase, will actually be our initial regulatory point, at least from a development aspect, that we need to have ready to go.
Right.
But with the other areas that we will need as well is, Commissioner Zuniga mentioned machine testing. I think you mentioned surveillance and internal controls. So what we need to do is, because the slots are 11 months out, we need to focus on internal controls and surveillance requirements up front for the slot parlors, so that we have that ready at least. And the best way would be so that in that period, the early part of construction, we're prepared from our regulation prospect to give guidance to those coming up with the plans and designing those elements. So that's a little bit of the process.
Right.
Followed by that, and it's on the chart with dates, is we need to then go from that to the specific consideration about the machine approval side.
Right.
And one thing is for sure, one thing we have to do, and I'm kind of going ahead in my notes a little bit, but that's actually tied as well to when we move into a new facility. practically speaking, obviously, we can't test any electronic gaming equipment where we're at now. So what that may very well mean, if we're probably talking the need to be fairly well prepared to test by June. Likely not be able to get there because we probably won't be moved by that time. But we are talking about a facility of 1,250 machines. So what that means is we actually, we may be in a good position, as Commissioner Zuniga mentioned, to be able to phase into that, to take a little more advantage of a private contractor initially, as we finish developing our expertise and we move into the facility that actually has the space for that. So, and then as we go forward with that process of development, we've got to then have our regulations ready to go relative to tax and revenue collection and monitoring. That'll be another set that we've got to have to take place. The final set, we go back to that regulation as we get closer. We need then to expand our surveillance and our internal controls relative to the resort complexes, and then probably the final set that we see at this point will be table games, for instance.
Right.
And intermixed is, and part of what this chart's trying to say is, intermixed in that process is the work with the state police, because to increase their staff, we've also got to be involved in academy training, got to project that forward to make sure they're available as well. And then we've got to, in the finals context, we'll probably have to have we'll have regulatory responsibilities with the slot parlor before we have more staff for regulation for the casino. So we're going to end up having to have and there's an early training on this side, gambling specialized training that we'll be following later on in that picture with a broader scope training for the rest of the regulatory staff as we move forward. And this concept of really tying these sections of regulations are kind of the first time we've had this discussion. This is kind of a process that is looking to me is real practical, because it will also have a lot of benefits about causing discussions about objectives, risk, those kind of things about what the commission might be looking at, and even be able to help develop things like objectives for performance management as people are discussing results that they may want out of those particular regulations. So I agree it's a many-step process in there, and I
No,
think...
but this is the first time we've ever heard you talk. I mean, that was a reassuring conversation, that was a reassuring soliloquy there, that you've, and many of the steps you're talking about are here on the chart, which is why it was important for us. I wanted to do this today so that we began to see. But you obviously do have a grasp on this, and you're very much aware of the connection that the regs have to precede the operation and so forth. So that's great, but I just want to keep talking about that and keep making sure you know where you're going, but we don't to some extent. And I want to make sure that we just keep apprised to that. But this is a huge step in the right direction, and I'm pleased to see this. This is reassuring, and to hear you talk about it, with a clear, articulated sense of sequencing and priorities is really helpful. Good.
I agree with that. This is the first time we've had this, and just looking through it, you can begin to see where we need to make policy judgments and the like, and it's going to be iterative. I mean, it's going to change as we go forward. But for the first time, we've had the detail as well as this big picture thing, and so I think it's going to be really helpful, as you suggest to us all, to have this and have it in this detail and begin to
I think so.
unpack it.
Yeah, that's great. And I think it would be worth having part of a session, sometime pretty soon, just focusing on this orange section, and really just walking through each one of these things and fleshing it out even further. But I agree, this is really great.
Well, and I think what it is helping is you and Mr. McHugh have mentioned, is it's kind of helping focus on those policy decisions, and then I think it's going to help as we bring the policy decisions, they're kind of targeted. So instead of we kind of have a multiple list that we've maybe got the first ones that we for sure need the commission to decide on up front for you to take a look at, and then keep moving through those as we need to move forward with these rest of these regulations. So.
Right.
We talked about licensing, so.
I'm
we've got-
sorry,
No.
can I just emphasize something that's already been said, but it's very much an iterative process, of course. This is just the skeleton, if I may call it that. I anticipate that there will be a lot more detail behind each one of these mega processes. if you will.
Definitely, yeah. Like on the research side, right, with that degree of intensity. You know, just,
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Mr. Chairman.
well, I just was gonna, on the policy thing, you clearly have made up your mind that we will be doing our own testing of machines. And that may or may not be right, but it's certainly never thing we've ever decided, And that's just an example of one of those things that's sitting out there that needs to get onto our agenda quick, so we make that decision. Because you're operating on the assumption, I think, that we're gonna have our own testing lab, which we may or may not, but we've never talked about it, so.
Well, I do my best not to tip my hand, so to speak, in this, but.
We caught you this time.
From a regulatory aspect, I think it's a very solid approach. But on the other hand, one thing is clear, there's still a commission approval requirement, really, on what equipment actually goes into place in Massachusetts casinos. And the debate, in a lot of ways, is how the commission would actually get there. And there would have to be a monitor, really, if it was a private lab, a monitor of that contract with private labs and someone with the ability to be able to deal with that kind of technical level of equipment. So it in a lot of ways, there's the old model of used to be just a state lab and everything had to go for the approval. New model kind of came forward. Many states just use the private lab. And there's also kind of a process in between with certification to some extent from a private lab, plus determinations by the state lab and the state having its own expertise. So just a little glimpse, that is the area that I would encourage the commission to go forward, but I agree it's a central discussion to the regulation development as well.
Right,
So,
exactly.
We need to move forward.
Right.
This part of the chart here is, this top side is licensing development, and it's sort of disconnected, so to speak. And the reason is here, and David and I will be focusing on this again early this next week to put a little bit more meat to this. But of course, the licensing team has got to focus on, we've got applications coming in on the casinos and the administrative completeness process with submittal of the slots parlor on October 4th. So that's a process that they're getting ready to make sure that they're ready to accept those applications and process them through to the evaluation teams initially. And so we've already talked about periods of developing regulations, and are pretty much convinced we've got to have licensing regulations. And those generally are speaking of a set of general regulations that applies to all licensing, fees, then the various types, whether it be vendors, manufacturers, key employees, all that process has to be, and probably violations in essence, has to be part of the package to move forward. I did forget to mention one thing is applications. That's another part that we've got to get going a little bit more detailed in this area. So it's good to have David on board, and I had a discussion with their team and be able to have that ability and that extra resource to fine-tune this proposal. Underneath this, and I'll only touch on it briefly.
Could I just, before you move on, there too is another place, and as in all of these, where it seems to me a number of policy decisions are embedded. How are we going to deal with training schools, for example?
Yep.
Are we going to, what kind of an approach are we going to take to that? How are we going to deal with the licensing mechanism? Are we going to have it a casino-driven process, i.e. you have to have a job and then you come and apply for the license, or you get a license and then you go apply for a job? Those kinds of things just run through all this. And so your idea, Mr. Chairman, of perhaps unpacking these seriatim section by section and having a discussion about what policy decisions are embedded there would be enormously useful to us all, I think, at the appropriate time, when you're ready.
Yeah, I strongly agree with that.
And this, the last part of the chart is the administrative section, or I would, the overall agency administrative infrastructure. And one thing is we tried to do is even, there was a little discussion about how do you set a timeline and manage under what kind of a concept, and that's why we've kind of selected these major areas, which is the enforcement, the licensing, regulatory, and the general administration, so that we've got some timelines we can definitely move forward. We can match up with regulations and policy and have those discussions. Because there's a lot that the operating units, like the licensing and enforcement and regulation, are really going to be a little bit helpless without that infrastructure, which includes things like, obviously, the systems and the accounting ability for tax revenues and selection and recruiting and all that kind of process in HR. So that's part of what this part of the timeline, if you look down through the detail, you'll see some of those areas that come out as well. So I'm kind of at least my point.
Well, there's one more page.
The one more page is still under development.
Yeah, but I was glad to see, I assume Director Griffin has been already looking at her section of the...
This section I have not had the opportunity to discuss too much with Jill at this point.
Okay.
Up here in horse racing, though, we are in the process. We are going to actually add much very similar to the rest of the groups, and we'll start that process with giving some deadlines to our consultant next Tuesday, and then we'll come back in this as well with Director Dernberger to further develop that. So.
Right, great.
So this is our first draft, first opportunity to discuss it, and we have more to come. I have noted the possibility of being able to bring forward particular sections at a meeting, and maybe the policies that go with those sections. And we'll do that depending on when we anticipate that we need to move forward with those particular areas.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
But this is really helpful. This is really what we were looking for as we've been discussing. This is great.
Well, it's very interesting to move forward, and it is a process. You ask the question, this is what we've got to do, and of course, the question comes back, so when do you want to start it?
Right. Right.
All right, let's talk about that. So, thank you very much for the time. That's all I had from my perspective.
And I guess you gave us an update on all relevant procurement issues and hiring issues.
Yes.
Yeah, okay,
Yes.
great. Let's just take a quick break while Jennifer settles in, and we'll be back in a couple minutes. All right, we will reconvene the Gaming Commission Public Meeting number 75, and I think turn to Director Dernberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Commissioners. Good morning.
Good morning.
I don't really have an administrative update today, although I would like to replace it with the following comment that struck me after listening to the marine fisheries presentation. I like to draw parallels to things when I can, because I think it's an interesting exercise and it kind of makes you think about things in a way that you maybe haven't thought about it before. And I want to just note to you two similarities between that industry and the horse racing industry. One is that we heard during the presentation about industry and science working together to sustain, promote, and improve. And we're going to see that reflected actually in some of these regulations that I'm about to put to you today. We'll see an example of that in the horse racing industry. And the other is that we talked about you heard a lot about third and fourth and fifth generation fisheries families. And we have the same thing in horse racing. Many people who devote their lives to the industry, that is all their families ever known. So I just thought I would point that out during my administrative update.
Interesting.
And then turn to our proposed changes to 205 CMR 3.29, and it's parallel, 3.29 is in the harness chapter, and it's parallel regulation 4.52 in the thoroughbred chapter. This is medications and prohibited substances. What we've done today is we've brought forward a red line version, which incorporates some amendments to existing language, as well as two entirely new provisions that I'm going to introduce to you, along with a draft letter to the Local Government Advisory Council. What we would be asking for you today is to initiate the formal rulemaking process. So this is the kickoff and the introduction to that. So the red line version does have some amendments to existing language, which basically reflect either updates that have occurred over the previous year from the Association of Racing Commissioners International, or in some instances, we have expanded existing language to reflect some of the facts and circumstances in Massachusetts. The two new provisions, where I'm going to spend the majority of my time, reflect the culmination of about a 2-year process of promulgation and review by stakeholders and numerous racing, medication, and testing consortium committees. I've introduced that group to you before. And then, of course, ultimately, the Association of Racing Commissioners International. Specifically, what appears or will appear in the Massachusetts provisions, Section 3A2. This provision was approved by the, I'm going to use RCI, for Racing Commissioners International, Board of Directors on April 2nd of this year. This provision incorporates a schedule of controlled therapeutic medications and associated decision levels. I would note that as part of our regulatory reform, this racing division actually has used about 20 of the 24 decision levels in its regulation of horse racing this year. So in adopting this schedule of controlled therapeutic medications, the two things we'll be doing are adding the decision levels for an additional 4 medications and adopting these, what we call restricted administration times, which are in layman's terms withdrawal times. What will appear as Section 2F in the two rules was just recently approved by the RCI Board of Directors on July 31st in 2013. This provision introduces a point system that will attach to occupational licenses for medication violations, and it will serve to enhance suspensions incurred as a result of multiple offenses. The two provisions together constitute what we've talked about for much of the year, the Uniform Medication and Drug Testing Program initiative. We've discussed this at previous meetings. 8 jurisdictions, including this one, did pledge initial support to the program this past spring, and now we actually have a rule to support. So this is very exciting. I'd also note that since that time, there are 4 other jurisdictions that have also begun to deliberate on the matter. But the goal for the original group of 8 of the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states is to go through the rulemaking process in parallel, and we strive for a simultaneous regional effective date of January 1, 2014. I can either pause or I can give you a little bit more background on the two provisions. Should I just run with it?
Anybody? Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So additional background
Gallop
on
with it.
these.
Gallop
What was that?
with it.
Gallop with it. Get the bit between my teeth. All right. I want to talk to you about how the two provisions, the new provisions, are designed to complement each other and the effect that they're intended to have on the industry. So as you know, racing loves its alphabet soup. What we're going to do is introduce a new one to you today, and that's MMV. This describes the proposed penalty structure and stands for multiple medication violations. This provision, although impressive in its length, is designed to actually reach a very, very few licensees in North America. The Jockey Club, which is the governing body in thoroughbred racing, commissioned a report from McKinsey & Company about 2 years ago. And in that report, they looked at about 13,000 individually licensed trainers in North America over a 6-year period, 2005 to 2011. And of those 13,000 or so, they discovered that 12,800 had either no or only one violation during that 6-year period. About 5% of all licensees accounted for approximately 2/3 of all medication violations. And when they excluded trainers who went during that 6-year period, a number of years without any violations at all, only 200, or 1.5%, of all licensed trainers accounted for 1/3 of this country's medication violations. So it's that 1.5% of bad actors, if you will, that color the perception of our entire industry. And the previous inability to address this repeat offender notion is a serious, serious problem. That 1.5% is the group that this multiple medication violation penalty is designed to address. When we look at the controlled therapeutic medication schedule, we see, on the other hand, a provision that is designed to affect everybody in the industry, from occupational licensees to regulators to the betting public. This schedule is designed to draw a clear line in the sand about what is and is not acceptable, and the points that will attach to the licensee's record will reflect that distinction. In effect, if you choose to use medications which are not considered therapeutic, if you choose to use prohibited substances in your racehorses, that is an aggravating factor in the amount of points you would accrue on your license. For everyone else, the rule provides clear withdrawal guidelines in the form of restricted administration times and uniform decision levels so that horsemen and veterinarians can design appropriate health care regimens for the athletes in their care based on science and regulatory guidance, not based on which state their target race will be held. So with that, I will entertain questions. You have both the draft letter to the LGAC in the packet, as well as the red line versions of both rules as they appear in the harness chapter and in the thoroughbred chapter.
And these are identical to the other jurisdictions, right? This isn't, you haven't tweaked the language coming from the other jurisdictions, this is it.
The language that would be imported as a result of the red line is that which just came out of the RCI Board of Directors meeting, and is the same language that the other 7 states in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic have pledged to support.
But nobody else has adopted these yet. We'd be the first.
We would be the first to initiate the formal rulemaking process, but
Yeah.
these 8 states are all on target.
Right.
And they're going to initiate their process as a reflection of how long that rulemaking process takes, so that we have a simultaneous uniform flip the switch date of January 1.
Right. On sort of a philosophical basis, and you and I have discussed this a little bit, the reference to ARCI regulations and classifications is not anchored to any particular edition of those. And as a consequence, if ARCI changes the effective classification regime, for example, if we look at F to, on the second page of your document, to F1, which refers to the ARCI Uniform Classification for Foreign Substances. If the content of that changes, then in effect the content of our regulation changes, right? So there's a philosophical question as to whether we're content with that or not. In effect, we're giving control over the content of our regulation to somebody else without it coming back for us, as opposed to saying the ARC Uniform Classification for Foreign Substances version X, or in effect on date X. It seems to me we're trying to be uniform. It seems to me we ought to stay uniform. It seems to me that this is a helpful multi-state approach to horse racing, and we hope to get not only the Massachusetts horses, but cross-border horses here to race, so it's a helpful thing, but it is something that we ought to recognize we're doing.
Right.
And Commissioner, I think a simple way to address that, I'm trying to find the language, and it may be in the rule that just precedes this, 328 and 451, after where it discusses the Association of Racing Commissioners International Uniform Classification Guidelines
Right.
in existence at that time. That language does appear somewhere in one of the other rules, so it may be as simple as adding that in effect at the time of the violation.
Yeah, but that wouldn't really, I mean, that doesn't address, I mean, that doesn't address the issue I was trying to raise. That would make it more clear. So you couldn't have an offense and then be penalized under a post-offense change. But it still would allow ARCI, in effect, to set the rules under which we were operating, or set a piece of the rules under which we were operating. So it's just something I think we ought to be aware of and decide whether we want to do that or not. I think it makes sense to do it, but.
I agree.
How is it just on that point, incorporating a rule by reference, how often is ARCI anticipating, if they are, to change some of the the guidelines or the thresholds? I was thinking about it in the context of the concentration thresholds. The science evolves from time to time, and maybe those thresholds change, correct?
Right, so it is intended to be a living, breathing document. There are quarterly meetings of Racing Commissioners International. The uniform classification guidelines do change from time to time based on, as you say, new developments, particularly in testing methodology. And so we do anticipate that there would be changes. And when we look at other jurisdictions, they handle the incorporation by reference sort of in three different ways. And one is to do it in existence at that time of the violation. One is to cite a specific version, so version 4.3. And the other is to just go through the rulemaking process every time that there is a change, which for this commission, with its frequency of meetings, is not an insurmountable obstacle as it is in some commissions that only perhaps meet quarterly. And so we see all three approaches out there. The incorporation by reference, of course, is the ideal for the reasons that we discussed, the ideal for the industry for the reasons we discussed. It may not fit with what this commission wants to do, but I don't see any practical effect why we couldn't go through a rulemaking process if there were changes.
We also can have a negative option. We can always, when we see changes, we don't have to accept them. We can always have a meeting or a review and choose not to accept them. It's a question of where the presumption is, I think.
Well, it's also notice to the world.
Right.
There is an element of that, notice to the world that we are now under a new regime here. We've added drug X to the prohibited substance list. And it wasn't on the list at the time we adopted these regs. So ARCI has put it on their list. We now adopt that, and it's on our list as well. That's one way to do it. The other way is just make everybody go to the current ARCI list by, I suppose, adding language in effect at the time of the violation. Would help with notice. It wouldn't help with the delegation piece.
And to the notice, I would just point out that when these changes occur, they have gone through the Scientific Advisory Subcommittee with Racing and Medication Testing Consortium. So there is some industry dialogue for a number of months leading up to the time it would even leave the RMTC. When it leaves RMTC, it then goes to Racing Commissioners International. So there is always quite a few months of lead time in industry discussion. They don't come out of just the Model Rules Committee one day and then go to the Board of Directors. So in terms of notice within the industry, typically these changes, one, they're not usually dramatic. They're usually an adjustment of a threshold level, but if you are adopting a new threshold for a new drug, there is a fair amount of lead-up time, and this racing division staff would certainly be prepared to issue directives and notices ahead of time to sort of flag this for our participants.
What, in your opinion, better gets to the goal of enhancing the product? An incorporation by reference, because ultimately that's what we're trying to do. The rulemaking process, even though we meet every other week, that may or may not be the case a year from now. So what's your opinion?
This is meant to go before commissions for adoption by reference. So to the uniformity piece, the adoption by reference is the way to go. To the notice piece, and I am a big believer, as you know, in affording all of the due process that we can to our licensees. I think there's definitely, we can't underemphasize the import of the notice. So I'm comfortable being able to discuss this issue, bring it before the commission before a rule change would be anticipated to go to RCI. But I may not always be in this position, and you may not always be on that side of the table. So although I think uniformity is a very, very important goal for this industry, I think probably going through the rulemaking process serves a very good purpose. In terms of bettering the product, which is my ultimate goal, I'm not sure that either one or the other than having the story to tell that this is a uniform initiative. I think that is an important story to tell.
Does it send a signal, if we were to do one versus the other, does it send a signal to the industry? Is there a trade-off in that respect?
I think being able to tell again the story of the uniformity is important, but I think that may be a distinction without a difference at the high level.
I didn't get that.
Telling the story of uniformity is important for one audience, but the distinction between incorporating by reference and going through the regular rulemaking process, that may be a distinction that is not necessarily understood by everybody that is watching and reading in the press.
So it wouldn't be considered like a qualified adoption of the principle of
I don't think so, because I'm quite certain that there are some states that can't adopt by reference, and so I think you're going to find some states are not able to do that. And in fact, one of the states has to go through statute rather than just the rule change on this. And so I think that uniformity is the goal, but the reality is that we do still operate in a state system.
Right.
So I'm comfortable.
And the principle, even if we locked it down to a particular edition of the uniform classification, the principle wouldn't be adversely affected by that, because the principle is the multiple
Yep.
violation penalties, which would be uniform.
Yeah.
Does the system, in using RCI as kind of the repository for all the information on the trainers, make it easier for us to track who the bad actors are before they show up in our state?
So it is the linchpin of this MMV provision, absolutely. So the information that is input into RCI, of course, is dependent on the individual jurisdictions that put it in.
Right.
And the RCI has made it very, very clear its expectations of its members in making sure that this information is entered in a timely and accurate fashion. We currently, just so you know, with our licensing process, when someone comes in and applies for an occupational license, our licensing staff does currently pull up the RCI, the licensee's ruling record, before licensing determination is made. And that's something that most jurisdictions are doing, or have been doing for years, and that's standard practice.
Can you walk me through the penalty process? If I am a trainer and I have been found guilty of a Class A violation for a non-controlled substance, I pick up 6 points. So I look at the other chart and I find that 6 points, I'm going to get suspended for 60 days.
Actually, the 6 points would get you the 60-day suspension if you had another violation. So this only attaches on your second violation.
Okay.
So the current recommendation for a Class A penalty, I think, is a minimum of 1 year. This is the really bad stuff. We don't see much of it in racing, thank goodness.
Right.
There's a range in the recommended penalty guidelines. There's always a range given, but that is the most serious penalty. So the answer to your question is, if there's a notice of finding in a laboratory report, you go before the stewards or judges for an administrative hearing. If the finder of fact determines that that finding is valid, and you now have a violation, you have the ability, of course, to appeal that. These points do not attach. The 6 points would not attach to your license until all of your administrative appeals had been exhausted.
Correct.
And if it was sent out to an outside court, if the appeal was taken to the outside court, that's noted in the ruling. And so if we had somebody who was being licensed here or had a medication violation here, and our stewards and judges were looking at their record, there would be a note that those points were pending an appeal. So these points would not attach to a license until the administrative appeals were exhausted.
Okay. Now, let's say I'm not a very good trainer, I get found in violation again, and now I'm tipping the points to a longer
Yes.
range.
So if you had...
Are those added on to
Yep.
the, okay.
Yep. So if you had a Category C penalty or a Category B penalty, and we were going to find a suspension of 15 days would be appropriate, and you went and looked at your points, you would have an extra period of time based on how many points. So you'd have your 15 days, and then this multiple medication violation suspension would be added after that. Not concurrently, but after.
Which mechanism gets to precisely the point that you started, which is getting to the repeat offenders.
Yep.
Right.
It's the you accumulate points, the more that you offend.
Yes, and
Suspended.
based on stakeholder input, there are a couple of provisions that are designed to enable a licensee to apply for expungement of those points after a given period of time of being found violation-free, so those can come off on the minor penalties. We also have given the stewards and judges discretion if there's a situation where there are multiple findings in a short window of time. Actually, we had an example here in the Commonwealth this year where there were 2 violations found with the same trainer, but the way the lab results came back, they were on 2 separate days, but they came back at the same time, the results. So that's considered a single penalty because the licensee didn't have notice that his medication program was in violation. So that's in here as well, so that if there were a situation like that, the trainer wouldn't accumulate, say, 3 points plus 3 points plus 3 points. It would be a single offense.
I sort of like adopting it by reference, and it seems modern, sort of, to do it, and it seems the strongest endorsement of the principle, but I don't feel strongly if others wanted to go the other way, it'd be fine with me.
I feel just like you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's a group that has worked a lot to develop this system. Uniformity is a great principle, and it occurs to me that we will be appraised of, developments as they continue to occur relative to updating those reference documents. So there's a lot of options that we may have through the rulemaking process, even if we incorporate by reference.
Anybody else?
What about adding the words "in effect at the time of the violation," just to
Would be
cinch
fine,
that
too.
down? I mean, you'd still have the delegation, but you'd add a significant element of clarity so that people would understand that they'd have
Yeah.
to maybe look at it earlier.
I think that's great. That's a great recommendation.
And it parallels existing language that's in the previous rule to this. So,
Right.
yeah.
The only other question I'd raise, and it's a minor one, but again, it's just designed to add some clarity, and that is on the next page, below that first chart, which it says MMVs are not a substitute for the current penalty system. It seems to me clarity would be aided by a reference back to the
Mhm.
paragraphs that we can find that current penalty system.
I agree.
That's in a different section of the regs.
Yeah.
And I think it would help everybody if they had a reference point back.
Do you want to put that into a motion?
Sure. I move that the commission accept and adopt the proposed changes to 205 CMR 3.29 and 4.52 with the addition of language to to subsection 2.F1 that ties the offense to the uniform classification in effect at the time of the offense, and that adds a reference to the section of the regulations containing the current penalty system.
Second. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it unanimously. Next.
This is really a helpful thing, I think, to bring continue to bring Massachusetts to the fore of a nationwide movement that's designed to stimulate top-level racing throughout the country.
Yeah, I agree. And as I said, I think of this as a model for the research work, too. Following your model on that. I think it's great.
I think that the commission should not underestimate the significance of that decision to the industry. The talk of uniformity has been decades in the making. The momentum that we've seen in the last couple of years has never been seen before in the industry. And having this group, this regional group, come together over this year has sent a significant message, I think. And so being part of this initiative, I think you should all be very, very proud of yourselves. So.
Thank you.
Well, thanks to you.
Yeah.
And with that, we will move on to the draft application to conduct a live racing meeting in 2014. This is the second version that has come before you. We put this out after the last meeting for public comment and sent drafts to our licensees, our existing licensees. We've received no comment to date. What I've done in the cover memo is draw your attention again to the new provisions that are in here. And what we've done is gone back and corrected some of the cut and paste typos that had occurred in the previous version, added a little bit of new language just to clarify and be perfectly in parallel with the statute. The new items there, which we can go through again if you'd like, 17, 23, 26, 7, 8, and 9, and 30. Happy to walk through those if you'd like to. We did that at the previous meeting, and I don't know that I have any new information to add, but it may be in a new context for you, so I'm happy to answer any questions. Applications are due to the commission on or before October 1st, and the decision occurs by November 15th.
So if we adopt this one, then not only will the applicants have have notice as of the time we adopt it, but if we adopt it in this form, they've already had a couple of weeks' notice that this is
On the
what
new
we're gonna do.
material, yeah.
So,
I would just add that we will be, over the winter, going through our Phase 4 rulemaking process, which will include changes to duties of licensees, and the 30 or so questions that were brought forward from previous applications are going to be reopened at that time so that they can parallel the regulatory changes that we'll put before you, and that was why we hadn't done any substantive change to the existing application, other than adding some new items.
Anybody?
Looks good to me.
Somebody want to move?
Sure. I move that that this commission adopt the recommendations set forth in Director Dornberg's memo and release the application for license to conduct a racing meeting as presented to this commission.
Second?
second.
Any further consideration? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Ayes have it unanimously. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Concludes the Racing Division's update.
Okay,
Thank you.
great. Now we have a combination of ombudsman and legal. Ombudsman Ziemba and Director Blue, General Counsel Blue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. Catherine and I make a joint presentation today as she and I have been asked to answer increasingly more involved and detailed questions from applicants and communities. Most of the questions that we receive day to day are answerable by just simply pointing to the relevant statutes or to the relevant portions of our regulations. Some of the questions that we receive are not answerable at this time because they involve questions of what will need to be done in our next phase of our regulations, our Phase 3 regulations. However, some questions that we receive are involve application of our current regulations to fact patterns or situations that could have very significant impacts either on the Commission's policies, applicants, or communities. In regard to this third grouping of questions, rare but significant questions, our regulations outline a way to reach a resolution to these questions. Our regulations in 205 CMR 1.10605 state that the Commission may, in its discretion, provide advisory services pursuant to MGL 23K47 or make advisory rulings pursuant to MGL Chapter 30A8. However, the regulations, they do not specify how the Commission would, in these rare instances, provide advisory rulings. We have from time to time been asked how the Commission would make such rulings. In general, we think that each question is likely to be rather unique. However, Catherine and I were hoping that today the Commission could discuss how it may want to consider such questions as we go forward, as we near the application deadlines. I'll let Catherine provide a little bit more detail. However, some of the questions that perhaps could be discussed by the commission are whether staff should present opinions to the commission, whether or not they would involve questions of a general public hearing, or in certain instances, whether or not an adjudicatory hearing would be necessary for some of these advisory questions. I'll ask Catherine if she'd like to add a little bit more about that.
Chapter 30A, Section 8, it allows any agency that wants to issue an advisory opinion to determine the process by which they do that. So it would be within the commission's discretion to decide. The process could be multi-layered. It could have different levels for different types of decisions. It could range anywhere from a situation where maybe certain authority is delegated to staff to allow certain opinions, all the way up to perhaps an adjudicatory type proceeding in front of the commission. So we were hoping today we could have a discussion on how the commission felt about certain kinds of issues. The issues that John and I are seeing tend to be very unique so far, and so they are very fact-based, but I don't imagine that will always be the case. We will probably get a lot of different kinds of questions, and they will range from questions that pertain purely to our statute, maybe a section for which we don't have detailed regulations, or our regulations themselves, where maybe we've drafted regulations, but there was a particular fact pattern or a possible issue that would arise that, wasn't contemplated at the time that it was drafted. So that's what we're hoping today, to maybe start that discussion and then put it into some sort of a process or a policy, and then, use it going forward.
It's really hard, it seems to me, to discuss, to come to a definitive resolution in the abstract of this kind of a broad question. It's a very useful discussion to have and to think about, but it's very hard to come up with a firm, this kind of question is going to be answered in this kind of fashion, resolution of this issue. It seems to me that one approach that we could take is one that simply gives some guidance, and then decide on a case-by-case basis which, if there's any doubt, which of the approaches we're going to take. We can, as General Counsel Blue has suggested, delegate to staff the ability to give opinions. Frankly, I think at the outset at least, we ought to be spare in our delegation of that kind of thing until we figure out what kinds of questions are arising. A second approach is to have a public hearing of the type that we have had for a lot of issues, and make some decision at the end of that public hearing. And it seems to me that those kinds of, that mechanism for resolving things really has to do with questions of policy. What are we going to do with this ambiguous regulation or this ambiguous part of a statute in general? What is our approach going to be? For example, if we are going to allow involuntary assessments to surrounding communities for traffic studies, are we going to look more favorably on requests for review of an existing study, or are we going to look more favorably on requests for reviews of new studies? I mean, that kind of thing, and I just picked that as an example of a kind of thing that we could probably decide and should decide after a public hearing. The third kind of resolution is an adjudicatory hearing, and I think that if there is a specific fact question, are we a surrounding community? Of course, that's part of our process. Are we entitled to X under these specific circumstances? Those, I think, we have to do on an adjudicatory hearing, because they are intensely fact-based, and we want to create a record so that once the decision is made, the basis for our decision-making is entirely clear, and so that if there is to be an appeal to some other forum, the reviewer will be able to understand how we got to where we got and on what facts. Because if the facts change between the time we make the advisory opinion and the time some action item occurs, that may invalidate the advisory opinion and cause us to re-examine the thing again. And it's important for us and for everybody to understand the factual backdrop on which we've made the decision. There will be, even if we have that kind of approach, policy decisions typically by public hearing, fact-based decisions typically by an adjudicatory hearing. There's going to be areas of gray that we're just going to have to decide which camp it falls into. We'll have to do that on a case-by-case basis. But in general, that's what I'd recommend we do. And I don't think we can do much more in the abstract than say that that's what we're going to do.
Well, and I don't know how, I was going to start at the same place, how useful that is, I mean, it's, if that's useful to you, fine, but it's not as if, unless, we don't have a pattern or a series of situations that have come up that are looking for advisory opinions. We have, I don't know if we have any, I mean, we have the debate about whether Boston is a host community for Everett. The situation in Plain Ridge is a different situation. That's not looking for an advisory opinion. Somebody may come to us and say, can we be a new applicant? The issue in Tewksbury is a unique one about how do you undo an election. That's not an advisory opinion. So I think we're torturing ourselves to come up with a general principle for something for which there is no general demand. It's only a very infrequent fact-based situation. And I think that principle is interesting and useful to some big extent, but really not helpful to anybody because it has to do with, because we can't apply it until we know what the situation is.
Well, I'm not sure that I agree fully with that,
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, and I think that there are situations in which knowing that if you're looking for a factual resolution of a factual problem, we're most likely looking for an adjudicatory hearing. And if we're looking for a policy judgment, we're most likely going to have a public hearing and an ability to come in and talk to the commission relatively informally, get a result, this is the policy that is going to apply, is of assistance to planners. I think as matters currently stand, there is, and can be in the minds of some people, a wonder, a question about whether any advisory opinion is ever going to result in an adjudicatory hearing. And I think saying yes, under some circumstances it will, would be helpful, and would be helpful to the staff to be able to say, this is what the commission's general feeling is. I anticipate that the commission will want to do this by X. To be sure, a pattern hasn't emerged, but there are questions that are beginning to arise that, in which I think this guidance, however broad it is, would be helpful and would be helpful to the staff in their communications with applicants.
Fine, I mean, that's fine, and you asked for it, so ipso facto, I guess it is useful, so that's, but as you know, because we've talked about this before, that the particular issue that we've had concern about, and you guys have been tracking to some extent, is this issue about the Boston host community debate. And I've not talked about this, I talked about this a little bit with Commissioner Cameron because I knew she wasn't going to be here, and I wanted to get a sense of where she was coming from. I've not talked about it with the other commissioners. I don't know what your views are about this. But another sort of guiding principle that we have used have been to let the local decisions be local, because that's what the legislation clearly anticipated, and we've chosen to delegate quite dramatically to the local folks to resolve these threshold issues. But we've always said, unless, one, it in some way runs the risk of impugning the integrity of the overall process, or two, impedes our process. when we went through the discussion with Springfield about, their process. We at first were concerned, but we backed off because we said, you know what, this is a local decision. As long as it doesn't have anything to do with the integrity of the process or our actual schedule, we're fine with it. In this case, in the Boston case, I am concerned that it is triggering both of those markers. That where you have two parties that are spatting in public, it makes everything look disorganized and suspect and political. There are allegations of bullying and browbeating and so forth, and the public doesn't know whether we're being bullied or not. And we aren't, and I don't want anybody to think that we are. Similarly, people are very confused. I mean, if I were in Charlestown, for example, I wouldn't know whether I was coming or going in terms of host community or surrounding community. If I were in a public official, I wouldn't know how to act. And then third, we're running out of time. If Boston is a host community, that's going to be an incredibly elaborate process to negotiate a host community agreement. If it's a surrounding community, it's also going to be a very elaborate process, and everybody's having a hard time getting around to negotiating their surrounding community agreements in time, which if they don't get done in time, it's going to put this colossal burden on us to have all these arbitrations while we're trying to get through our decision-making process. So what we have repeatedly asked Ombudsman Ziemba is this about to get resolved? Are the parties coming to the table as negotiators in good faith and putting cards and data on the table and working to the solution of what is maybe a controversial issue? I don't know how complicated it is, but let's grant that it is complicated. Are they getting to yes here, one way or the other, or no? And I don't hear that they are. So my predilection, and I believe for what it's worth that Commissioner Cameron feels the same way, is it is pretty near time, if it isn't time, for us to intercede and say, this has got to get resolved by a date certain, or we will resolve it ourselves. I don't think the public interest is served, and I don't think our interests are served by having this this negotiating contest go on in the way that it's going on. So that's where I come at this particular issue. And I'm curious to know where everybody else is.
Have we segued now into a discussion of the Boston Everett issue?
Yeah.
Well, could I make a
That
point?
was a dramatic segue.
It was. I just want to bring up a point before we go on to another issue. One of the more basic questions that the commission could address on this advisory opinion issue is a question that John and I get all the time, which is if I have a question for the commission, how do I submit it to you? As you know, a lot of what we deal with are municipal officials or lawyers, and they're looking for a format. So we'll get questions about, do you have a form? Do you have a particular way you want it to come? So if the commission wanted to create a process, for example, that if you have a question, you must submit it in writing to a particular organization. It could go to John, it could come to legal in a format that's, only so long or with a direct request attached to it. We could at least make maybe a process that starts that, and then folks could submit things, and we could evaluate what kind of a process it went through from there. So we do get that question quite a bit. How do I submit a question to you?
That's fine, too. I didn't mean to be jumping off. If you were still wanting to stay on another track, I thought this topic about general principles was sort of a proxy for a particular topic. So I wanted to get past the proxy and get to the particular topic. But if you want to continue to talk about it at the abstract, I'm fine with that.
Well, the reason I said it was a dramatic departure, and we did talk a little bit about this specific subject at our last meeting.
Right.
And we need to talk about it. But the reason I said it was a dramatic departure is that topic isn't on the agenda. And I'm a little concerned about us discussing and coming to some resolution of a topic that's not on the agenda. I share your concern about that particular issue. Maybe not all of the ways that you've articulated that concern and all the ramifications of it, but I share your concern about it. But however that concern manifests itself and however we're called upon to resolve it ultimately, it seems to me helpful for everybody involved and all observers to understand that a possibility is an adjudicatory hearing, because it may be so intensely fact-based that we can't do it in a general hearing. We have to decide that ultimately, but it seems to me that that is an option that the participants ought to know about, that may be, because that may have ramifications
I agree.
on the speed and
Right.
substance of the resolution. So that's my only point. I would like to have that on the agenda at some point, and when it's ripe, and see if we can be of assistance in resolving.
Yeah. Well, let's separate the two things. I agree on the first point, and it is instructive, it is helpful, and it's worth talking about. And if we want to clarify it further on what a process might be, I think that's constructive too. In my mind, as the agenda setter, it is on the agenda. We've talked about this at length when we were setting up the agenda, and I thought that under general update, we would be asking Ombudsman Ziemba to tell us. I thought we were going to be talking about all these different communities that are having a couple of sort of unique problems, including this one. So I anticipated that it was on the agenda under the update from the Ombudsman.
Can I go back to maybe the easiest thing to coalesce around is this notion of submitting questions to the commission. To me, that we've had the general mailbox. Everybody talks to John and Catherine. I think it's pretty straightforward. That as open as we can be. I wouldn't want us to go down a path of having to be a particular format or form, as long as we can get to the core of the issue, any which way we can. I agree with Commissioner McHugh that perhaps the distinction is around the fact, the intensity of the facts that may, in the interest of the public purpose that we have, be better served with an adjudicatory process. But we can only know until we get that question formally, and we have some understanding of what those facts may be, and or may not be. So that really ought to be, in my opinion, the test. And we always have we can always decide that after some public hearing, if you will, which we can always do. So just communicating those as two options out there, I think could go a long way towards the next steps on these or any other. But I think it's very important that we, in some of the issues that you highlight, Mr. Chairman, that we come out with advisory opinions, which is what it looks like some of these parties may be seeking.
Yeah. Are we still talking about this general process? Do you want to do that, or?
I think you've provided us sufficient guidance in that regard.
Okay.
I have a question kind of to the timing of that. I mean, we're obviously allowed to create our own process, but is it a process that needs to go through emergency regulations or, the formal regulatory process, or is it just something we adopt kind of in-house and that's sufficient to meet the letter of the law?
I think we can have something we adopt in-house. I mean, we have always been very flexible, and, the commission is correct that calls and questions come into us from all kinds of sources. We're very open to talking to anyone that wants to talk to us. So I don't think we need a formal regulatory-driven process, but just something that we know how we will, generally address certain issues. And then we'll raise them to the commission if they're very specific or very fact-intensive to see what you want to do when they come up.
Can you now give us a status report on Boston and Everett?
As you wish, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, as you referenced, the commission has been working with the parties to encourage them to work together in the interest of understanding the proposed facility. and all of its impacts. We've had numerous conversations with the parties to encourage such a dialogue. Despite these efforts and the efforts of the parties, we are perhaps less optimistic that the parties will soon reach a resolution as they are going forward under the current process. There remains a number of different ways that the parties could reach an understanding of the facility and its impacts, such as more intense Gaming Commission staff-led discussions or direct contact and communications by counsel for the two parties. In general, while there obviously is significant time between now and December 31st, as is the case around the state, that time is growing very short.
So if we, there's one, so if we don't do anything, maybe somebody will petition us for an opinion. We don't know whether they will or not. Maybe they'll just keep talking, and I don't know what happens if we've never really talked about what happens if we get to the point of application and somebody is saying they're a host community and somebody is saying they aren't. We've never, so I guess we'd have to resolve it at that point. Were you going to say something?
Yes, I think that's absolutely right, and that's sort of like a game of chicken. And it seems to me that we ought to prevent those kinds of games from happening, and to the extent we can. We did talk last time about inviting the two to come in and talk to us as a first step. They don't, not going to issue subpoenas, but invite the two to come in so that we can hear from them and perhaps make some constructive suggestions. And then if somebody wanted to petition us for something more formal, they're certainly free to do that. But that's one way to approach it. And I'm in accord with you that we ought to see if we can't facilitate this resolution, because it seems from Ombudsman Ziemba's report to be that it's going nowhere at the moment.
I'm perpetually optimistic.
Oh, I know you are. You have this perpetual optimistic halo with, but even under that halo,
Even
you
that.
seem to be.
There's another factor, and it's a marginal one, but we've seen how marginal ones become real. If it turned out, for example, that it was determined by somebody that Boston was a host community for the Wynn proposal, and Boston hypothetically elected not to negotiate with and not permit themselves to be a host community, which would be within their rights, because they've already expressed support of another idea. That would mean that Wynn couldn't go forward. Wynn could look in southeastern Mass. If we move fast enough, they could look at southeastern Mass. I have no idea whether any of that is plausible or not, but we've seen what's happened with our other licenses, and in terms of keeping doors open and maximizing the opportunity for continuing competition, that's another reason not to let this drag out. There's not a lot of time left, but there's some. So it would seem to me that, I mean, what you two have said is that if it ends up having to be we who decide this, which it's looking like it will, we are best served by an adjudicatory proceeding, because that maximizes our options and our authority. And if that's right, if those two things are true, it's likely going to be we who decide it, and we are best served by doing that in an adjudicatory environment, hearing environment. Then I would suggest that we establish that now. I mean, set that up for, it can't be next week, you're not going to be around, but the week after, either at our meeting on the 4th, or maybe there's a special meeting, I'm not quite sure of the exact logistics. But if we just invite them in for a hearing, and then we have to wait and again to do an adjudicatory hearing, we're going to be really up against it, never mind all this, the PR that's floating around out there, confusing everybody about what's going on. So, if I'm right on those two principles, likely we and adjudicatory is the way to go, then my suggestion would be that we propose that under whatever the proper authorities are, if we have it, and I'm hearing from you that we do, that we have that sooner than later, perhaps as soon as our meeting on the 4th.
Well, I don't know whether General Counsel Blue has researched the question whether we can just reach out and take a controversy that we have read about and say, we're going to have an adjudicatory hearing on that, or whether we have to, I'll put a period there.
Yeah, we have not researched that fully. I would want to look to see, I would want to look at that in a little bit of detail. We would also decide if we wanted to have regulations, quite frankly, that would allow us to do that. That would be one way to do it, but we do need to look a little bit more closely at that.
There's nothing that prohibits us from inviting both sides to come in and have a discussion with us. There's nothing that prohibits us from doing that. And there's nothing that prohibits us from saying, as part of that discussion, if it would be helpful to resolve the issue definitively, that we would be happy to accept a petition from one side or the other to resolve it. And that would clearly give us the power to do it. And we could do that fairly quickly. The idea of being able simply to reach out and tell people that we're now going to have an adjudicatory hearing on a matter that really isn't before us is more tricky, and I think we need more research to figure out whether we have power.
Well, I thought I understood from the way that Catherine was talking that we did have that authority under that very broad authority to issue advisory opinions. But if you say we don't.
Well, we have
the question isn't
I think
before
we
us
have
yet.
the authority to use that mechanism for
Yes.
issuing an advisory opinion. It's a question of how do we get the controversy in front of us.
In front of us, yes.
Right? And
Right.
we don't have an ability to self-generate questions that we then issue a advisory. We may not.
Yeah, I thought we did, but it doesn't,
Okay.
so we don't know if we do or not.
All right.
So let's look into that. Just if we invited them in to come talk to us on the 4th, and we decided at that point that, whatever, we don't know what they would say, but we decide that we want to have an adjudicatory resolution to this, what would the process then be from the 4th on to the adjudicatory hearing?
Well, the process would be similar to the process we've used for other adjudicatory matters, so the suitability hearings are a good example. So we would schedule a pre-proceeding conference where we would go over the issues with both sides, where we would talk about exhibits, we would, talk about witnesses and representation. Once we agreed on that, we would probably put a week or two between that conference and when the hearing would be. It would take some time because both sides would want to be fully prepared to come before the commission. So you probably need anywhere from 2 weeks to 30 days to get that all in place.
So the option of looking to southeastern Mass dies with this plan.
Well, Mr. Chairman, as you know, we have a process whereby applicants that are already going through our application process do not have to abide by the September 30th deadline for applications.
Oh, I'd forgotten that. Good point.
Yeah, that's
Thank
right,
you.
so.
Great, that was good of us.
Very smart decision.
Good guy. Good. I'm
Chairman.
glad I thought of that.
I remember I came up with that.
Yeah.
I want to take full credit for that.
Well, that sounds,
But don't, let's not brush aside the power question here. the
No, that-
Jurisdictional question.
No,
And I
that's
know
very
you're not.
important,
I know you're
yes.
not.
It's important.
But even, and we need to do more research, and I think we can't lose sight of this. We need to do a little bit more research on the notion whether we have jurisdiction to say to contestants in some issue, we're going to have an adjudicatory
Right.
hearing and bind you.
I understand that.
Okay.
And I'm agreeing with your suggestion
Okay.
that we,
All right.
that we invite them in for the I mean, I think, let's articulate this right. What is it that we're saying here? If, it sounds like either somebody else can take a crack at it or I will, but it sounds like we're saying that we do not think that having this continue in the way it's been going is in the public interest, or compatible with what we want the process to be and to be perceived to be, both.
Right.
And for that reason, we are anxious to use our authority and good offices, such as they are, to expedite this decision. And we are certainly going to look to the full extent of our authority as among the range of options that we're going to determine what our full range of options is. And in that context, understanding where we're coming from, we would like to ask the two parties to come to talk to us about why they think their position is what it is.
Well, I would frame it more broadly,
Okay.
whether they believe that they're going to be able to resolve this on their own, and what the impediments to resolution are, and how we can help remove those impediments.
Okay, good.
Mr. Chairman, can I just say one thing for the
Sure,
record?
yeah.
There is no indication that the WIN folks have any interest in any other area of the Commonwealth rather than Everett. Everything that we've read, everything we understand is they're fully committed to the Everett proposal. I understand you were talking in generalities
Yeah.
of possibilities, but just so that people are clear, every indication is that they are very much committed to Everett, and there's no discussion of other
Yeah,
facilities.
I understand, and I was just winging that.
Yep.
If I were in their shoes, that's exactly what I would say, no matter what I really thought, but I hear what you're saying. Okay, I guess we don't really need, do we need we don't need a vote, I guess, to invite them in.
I think we can simply communicate the
Yeah.
invitation through the good officers.
Is there anything else that would be helpful from us, John, is in moving this ball down the?
No, I think that's sufficient, Mr. Chairman.
All right. What about is there anything to talk about on the other two situations, the Tewksbury and Plain Ridge?
Yes, so as a matter of my general report, I'll just go through
Yeah.
sort of the
Okay, I'm
list
sorry.
to that.
Go ahead, yeah.
No problem. As you know, we recently sent out a notice to all geographically adjacent communities, reminding them of the impending deadlines, and we provided direct contact information of all of the applicants to those communities and urged them to be in contact with those applicants to understand either the positive or negative impacts or the lack of impacts that may result from the facility. That recently went out. There was a recommendation that we talk with the Mass Municipal Association about further getting the word out. I'm happy to report that they are also distributing that notice to communities, to a wide dispersal of communities, because in our notice, we noted that just because a community is geographically adjacent, that doesn't mean that that community would be a surrounding community. And also our notice made mention that the fact that just because one is not geographically adjacent, that also doesn't mean that one could be a surrounding community. If you're 2 towns away, there's still a possibility that you could be a surrounding community. So the Mass Municipal Association notice to all communities helps further serve getting out the notice to all communities. And similarly, we posted that notice on our website to make sure that all communities are continue to be made aware of the impending deadlines and our hope that that these dialogues happen with applicants and communities. So thanks to the MMA for that.
Yeah, great.
Second item to report, as you know, earlier this week, the town meeting in Tewksbury rejected a zoning change that was necessary for the Penn National applicant. In public reports, Penn has stated that it will respect the opinion of the voters and will not continue its application in Tewksbury. However, there's an open question whether or not the local referendum can be stopped. We've had discussions with the Secretary of State's office, and the general proposition in the Commonwealth is that once an election is scheduled, there lacks the authority under the general laws to cancel those elections. In many instances, special legislation is required for some municipal elections to cancel elections once they have been initiated. Our conversations with the Secretary of State's office, we've indicated that this is a unique situation. Our statute is unique, and the commission has certain authority over elections. So in many ways, this might be out of the context of the normal municipal election. What we recommend is that we will continue to have conversations with the Secretary of State's office about any necessity of further action to be able to cancel the election. As you can imagine, going forward with the election would require some significant time and expense that is otherwise unnecessary. We've been informed by the applicant that they have had conversations with the municipality, and perhaps they would withdraw the election, but to the extent that there remains uncertainty about the legality of that, we'll continue to work with the Secretary of State's office, and perhaps within 2 weeks' time at our next commission meeting, we might have to put forward an emergency regulation for your consideration. Our hope is that is not necessary, but we can work on that for the next couple of weeks. September 4th is well before September 21st, which is the date of the election.
It also raises the interesting question of who pays, if it did have to go forward, who pays for it?
Well, it would be the applicant, in my,
Logically, it would be.
logically from the statute, now,
Yeah.
notwithstanding everything you've
Yeah.
said.
Yeah.
And we've made that point to the Secretary of State's office that these are unique elections and that they're not paid for by the public body. It is paid for by the applicant. So in that regard, this may be a different situation.
It's kind of somewhat of a close correlation, but there have been recent incidents where this has happened, but it's simply been a rescheduling of an election due to some event or what happens, but, dates get moved. Is that authority to move the date still what rests with the Secretary of State, or does that rest with the local clerk?
I think these are some of the things that we really need to talk to the election law experts about. Who has the authority? Obviously, the Secretary of State's office has general authority over conduct of elections, but what authority exists at the local level versus the Secretary of State versus our authority under our regulations? We have general authority to set the parameters of elections under our powers section, and so I think, I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer for you on that one.
No, just a general question as to who's had that authority in the past.
So we will, Mr. Grossman has been working with the Secretary of State's office. He will head this up upon his return on Monday.
Okay.
May need a bigger space on the 4th than the
right.
perm room.
Where's Ms. Riley?
So one other item that I have to report is that we are getting increased inquiries regarding the process for involuntary disbursements from communities. We've provided information about our process to dozens and dozens of communities about the ability of communities to ask for technical assistance dollars that are not voluntary by the applicant, but they are required by the commission. We continue to remind applicants that they'll be evaluated on how successful their outreach is, and the success in helping surrounding communities reach an impact agreement. And I guess this should be a continued reminder that it is up to the applicants to do that outreach and to assist communities, surrounding communities, potential surrounding communities, to help them understand their impacts.
Is there anything we can do to give you more tools to?
I think we have significant tools. Our regulations contemplate that even before the application is considered by the commission, the surrounding or potential surrounding community shall file its application with the applicant, noting that it is coming before the commission. There's a period of time by which the applicants will have to respond to that request. So even if an application gets filed for an involuntary disbursements, perhaps there is a period of time whereby the parties can come to a resolution so that it's not a matter that appears before the commission and would be probably negatively perceived by the commission in some instances.
Right, okay. Remind me, Rick and John, our schedule for awarding licenses in April, did that assume the appeal, the arbitration process for surrounding communities, or was that an add-on?
No.
If- You know what?
It assumes it.
It's an
It assumes it, okay. So April, so that, the April deadline, the April date for decision-making doesn't get screwed up if we have the surrounding community arbitration process, because that's in there.
Don't forget that, that's a tight time frame, by the way, the arbitration process, but
Schedule-wise, just for, I get to cheat and refer to it here,
Yeah.
because I happen to have it handy, but it looks like we had anticipated awarding the license on 4/11, but there would be an arbitration or a period that we've got about 30 days in there that would get us out to 4:30 if we had to have arbitrations.
Oh, all right, so it would,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
so it will extend it, because it's just, it's looking like, we could have a whole bunch of surrounding community arbitrations, and the bidders need to appreciate the fact that that will reflect on the quality of their relationships with their communities and in our criteria, but B, we've got this timing deadline for our licensing fees, but, so we could lose close to a month if we have a lot of, okay.
That's what I have to report.
And the Plain Ridge situation, we're just waiting to see if anything happens, and which
There have
case?
been public reports of dialogue between the former applicants and other gaming interests.
Steve and Dominic are here, so hope springs eternal. Okay, anything else for the ombudsman?
No, thank you.
Thank you. Great,
Keep the optimism.
yeah.
The hell of
Item 7 is other business, which was not anticipated. I don't think we have any such business. And item 8 is an executive session, and I will switch to a more formal. The commission will now go into executive session pursuant to MGL Chapter 38, Section 21A3, and 21A5, and 21A7, and MGL Chapter 66, and MGL Chapter 4, Section 7, CL 26F, in particular to discuss strategy with respect to the litigation with KG Urban, when discussion in an open meeting would have a detrimental effect on the litigation position of the commission. The commission will not reconvene in open session at the end of the executive session. Do I have a motion to go into executive session?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Moved and seconded. I'd like to take a roll call vote of the commission to go into executive session. Commissioner McHugh,
Aye.
Commissioner Stebbins,
Aye.
Commissioner Zuniga,
Aye.
and the chair votes yes. Thank you. The commission is now in executive session. All members of the public and any staff members not involved in the matters to be discussed are
Hey,
requested
Catherine?
to leave the room. I'd ask that all video and audio recording and live streaming be shut off and equipment removed from the room, and we will repair to a different room.